Homeless man asked JD Vance, "Can you give me $1?" JD's response is shocking. It was one of those afternoons where the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, but never quite delivered. The streets of downtown Cincinnati pulsed with life, cars rolling by in slow bursts, pedestrians moving at their own rhythms, some with purpose, some drifting without clear direction. The scent of damp pavement mixed with the lingering grease of fast food joints, a familiar aroma that clung to the air like an unspoken part of the city's character. The sidewalks were lined with aging storefronts, their signs flickering unevenly, some windows covered with posters peeling at the edges. Every now and then, the sharp honk of a passing car cut through the low hum of conversations, hurried footsteps, and the occasional laughter spilling out from a cafe's open door. JD Vance moved through it all, neither rushing nor dawdling. His steps were steady, deliberate, but there was a certain weight in the way he walked, as if his mind was elsewhere, working through thoughts far removed from the bustle around him. He was dressed casually, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth or status, just another man blending into the city. But even without the polished suit, even with his hands tucked deep into his jacket pockets, people noticed him. A few stole glances, nudging the person beside them, whispering his name. Some recognized him from TV, others from headlines, and a few from the stories that had circulated about his rise. But he wasn't here as a politician today, not in this moment. He was just a guy walking past a row of old buildings, dodging a scooter, abandoned on the sidewalk, lost in thought. Then, from somewhere in the noise of the city, a voice cut through, low but firm, rough around the edges. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" It wasn't the first time JD had heard those words. In cities like this, in moments like these, requests like that were part of the landscape. Most people ignored them, barely breaking stride as they shook their heads or muttered, "Sorry man," before disappearing into their own worlds. JD had done it himself before, more times than he could count. It wasn't cruelty. It was just how things worked. But something about this one was different. Maybe it was the way the voice wavered slightly, like the speaker had asked this question 1,000 times before and already knew the answer. Maybe it was the way he didn't immediately make eye contact, as if bracing himself for rejection before it even came. JD slowed his step, turning toward the voice. The man stood near the edge of the sidewalk, shoulders slightly hunched against the chill in the air. He was thin, too thin. Not just in the way hunger wears a person down, but in the way life itself had stripped him bare. His clothes were layered, mismatched, not for style but for survival. His beard was patchy, not in a way that suggested fashion, but neglect. His hands, cracked from exposure to the elements, twitched slightly, as if his body had learned to move even when there was nothing left to do. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't pleading, he was just there, waiting. JD studied him for a moment. Around them, the city continued, uninterested. A woman rushed past, her phone pressed to her ear, barely sparing them a glance. A man in a business suit stepped out of a nearby building, adjusting his tie, his expression blank as he walked in the opposite direction. A teenager hovered by a street lamp, hood pulled up, hands in his pockets, watching without looking like he was watching. Life moved forward, as it always did. "What's your name?" JD asked, his voice even, not demanding, just curious. The man blinked, clearly thrown off. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Usually, people either handed over a bill or kept walking. Small talk wasn't part of the transaction. He hesitated, then muttered, "Eddie." JD nodded slightly, as if letting the name settle between them. He could have just pulled out his wallet, handed Eddie $1, and moved on. It would have been easy. The simplest answer to a simple request. But something about Eddie, about the quiet way he stood there, about the way his shoulders weren't slumped in defeat, but in exhaustion, made JD pause. Maybe it was because, once upon a time, he had known that kind of exhaustion himself. Maybe not in the same way, but close enough to recognize it. "You live around here?" JD asked. Eddie let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I live wherever I can," he said. "You know how it is." JD nodded again. Yeah, he knew how it was, or at least he understood enough. The question now wasn't whether Eddie needed $1. The question was whether $1 would actually change anything. Eddie shifted on his feet, stuffing his hands deeper into the pockets of his oversized jacket. The fabric was stiff from wear, its original color lost to a dull, lifeless gray. His fingers curled into fists inside the fabric, not around anything, just holding onto the motion itself, as if it brought some kind of warmth. He was used to this moment, the ask, the pause, the rejection. It was a routine as much as it was survival. The trick was to keep it simple. $1. Not much, not enough to make someone feel like they were doing too much, but just enough that maybe, just maybe they'd say yes. Most people didn't. He knew the looks. Some shook their heads without even making eye contact. Some gave a polite but distant "sorry, man," before hurrying on, as if stopping would cost them more than they were willing to give. Others, the ones who really didn't care, just walked right past like he didn't even exist. It wasn't personal. It never was. People had their own problems. Some days, he didn't blame them. Some days, he wondered if he'd do the same if he were in their shoes. But this guy, he wasn't walking away. JD Vance stood there, hands still in his pockets, but not moving, not brushing Eddie off like he expected. Instead, he had asked for his name. That was different. People didn't usually ask for his name. It threw him off, like the script had changed, like this wasn't the way the conversation was supposed to go. "Eddie," he muttered, his voice low, rough from the cold and the years spent talking to people who never really listened. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable now, not because he was afraid, but because suddenly he wasn't invisible anymore. JD nodded, letting the name settle between them. He didn't smile, didn't react like he was trying to make Eddie feel better. He just stood there, considering something. Eddie knew that look, the weighing, the calculation. It wasn't new. People liked to size him up, like they were trying to figure out whether he was a lost cause or just another guy who'd made some bad choices. Maybe both. "You live around here?" JD asked. Eddie let out a small, humorless chuckle. "I live wherever I can," he said. "You know how it is." Did he? Maybe, maybe not. JD just nodded again, like he understood enough. Eddie shifted again, glancing toward the street. He didn't like standing in one place for too long. People started looking. A guy like JD could stop and have a conversation without a problem. But Eddie, if he lingered, someone might come over and tell him to move along. He'd been through it before. No loitering, no standing too close to businesses, no making people uncomfortable. Even if he wasn't doing anything, just existing in a space where some thought he didn't belong, it was enough to get him pushed along. But JD wasn't telling him to move along. He was still standing there, looking at him like he was thinking something over. Eddie exhaled sharply, rubbing a cracked knuckle against the rough stubble on his chin. "Look, man," he said, his voice softer this time, "I just need $1. That's all." The ask was always the same. Keep it simple. Keep it easy. $1 didn't make someone feel like they were giving too much. It was nothing to most people. A loose bill in their pocket, the change left over from buying coffee. The kind of money that didn't mean anything to someone who had it, but meant a hell of a lot to someone who didn't. JD didn't reach for his wallet.
Instead, he studied Eddie, his eyes flicking briefly to the layers of mismatched clothing, the way Eddie's shoulders slumped, not in surrender, but in sheer exhaustion. Not the kind that came from a long day of work, but the kind that settled deep into your bones when every day felt like the same fight over and over again. Eddie felt that pause stretch longer than he expected, longer than it should have. The rejection was coming. He was sure of it, but JD still wasn't walking away. A couple of people walked by, barely sparing them a glance. One man in a suit gave Eddie the usual sideways look, the kind that said, "Don't ask me," before picking up his pace. A woman carrying a grocery bag slowed just slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop. A teenager in a hoodie hovered a few feet away, eyes flicking between them, curious but trying not to seem like he was listening. Eddie felt the familiar weight of judgment settling in around him. It didn't matter how many times he'd been in this spot. Every single time, there was that moment where he wondered what people thought when they saw him. Did they see a guy down on his luck, or did they see someone who'd done this to himself? Did they see a man, or just another problem on the street? JD's voice cut through the noise again. "How long have you been out here?" Eddie stiffened slightly. That wasn't a question people usually asked, at least not the ones who kept walking. It was a question that led to more, and more questions meant explaining things Eddie didn't always feel like explaining. He hesitated, eyes flicking past JD toward the street, as if considering whether to answer at all. Then, with a short breath, he shrugged. "Too long." JD nodded, his breath visible in the cool air. The city had a way of swallowing moments like this, turning them into nothing more than passing glances and forgotten interactions. But something about this wasn't fading away. Eddie had been here before. Conversations that started like this usually ended the same way, with some kind of lecture about personal responsibility, a speech about hard work and pulling yourself up. He'd heard it all before. People who'd never lived a day on the streets telling him what he should be doing, like it was that easy. But JD still wasn't pulling out his wallet, and he still wasn't walking away. Instead, he asked, "What did you do before this?" Eddie exhaled hard, another sharp laugh, but this one bitter. "What, like work?" He shook his head, rubbing the side of his face. "I was a plumber." JD raised an eyebrow and Eddie smirked. "Not the fancy kind, residential work, mostly. Fixed leaks, replaced busted water heaters." He shrugged, his voice flattening. "Ain't much demand for a guy who doesn't have an address, though." JD didn't argue. He'd heard stories like this before. People who fell through the cracks so fast they barely had time to brace for impact. A lost job, a medical bill too high to pay, a landlord raising the rent overnight. One misstep, and suddenly there was no way back up. Eddie sighed, shifting his weight again. "So you gonna give me $1 or what?" His voice was quieter now, like he already knew the answer, like he was preparing for the moment to end the way it always did. But JD's answer wasn't what he expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie's forehead creased, his eyes narrowing. He had been through enough of these conversations to know what came next. The speech, the life advice, the suggestion to go find a shelter that was probably already full. He braced himself for the same thing he'd heard 100 times before. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon," he muttered. JD shook his head. "It's not a sermon." And just like that, the conversation had shifted. Eddie had asked for $1. He was about to be offered something he never saw coming. Eddie let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "I live wherever I can," he said, the words coming out like he'd been rehearsed too many times. There was no anger in his voice, no desperation, just a quiet acceptance, like he'd said it so often that even he had stopped expecting people to care. He shifted his weight, followed, glancing toward the street like he was considering whether to keep talking or just walk away. It was always a gamble, how much to say. Some people asked questions, but they didn't really want answers. They just wanted to hear something that fit their version of the story, something simple, something that made sense. JD didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, letting the silence settle between them. Eddie wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Most people moved on quickly, gave their $1, shook their heads, walked away. JD wasn't doing any of that. He was waiting, like he actually wanted to hear what Eddie had to say. That was unfamiliar territory. Eddie exhaled, rubbing his hands together, trying to warm them up. He had been out here too long. He didn't know how many days, not exactly. The weeks blurred together, and after a while, counting didn't matter. "I tried," he muttered after a beat, "a couple times." His voice was quieter now, as if saying it out loud made it harder to admit. "Shelters are full before I even get in the door. And the ones that aren't, well, some places, man, they're worse than the street." He sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "Tried working too. You know what they tell me? Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address. Come back when you got your life together. Like I can just pull that out of thin air." He scoffed, shaking his head. $1 don't fix that, but it helps for a minute." JD nodded slightly, his face unreadable. He glanced down the street, where a few people were slowing their steps, not close enough to be part of the conversation, but near enough to catch bits and pieces. A man leaned against a light post, pretending to check his phone. A woman with a grocery bag in her hand paused just slightly, eyes flicking between Eddie and JD before looking away again. People were watching. Eddie could feel it, that familiar weight of being seen but not really being noticed. He knew what they were thinking. Some were probably wondering why JD was even still standing there. Others had already made up their minds about him, about what kind of person he was, what kind of choices had led him here. "Would $1 really help?" JD asked suddenly. The question hit Eddie in a way he didn't expect. He blinked, caught off guard, his mouth opening slightly before he let out another sharp laugh. "Wouldn't hurt," he said after a moment, but there was something different in his tone now. Less certainty, less sure of the answer. JD studied him for a second before speaking again. "Would it change anything?" Eddie's jaw tightened just slightly. There it was. The part where the conversation turned into something else, where it stopped being about a simple request and became a conversation about something bigger, something harder to walk away from. He had been through this before, with people who wanted to tell him how to fix his life, how easy it was if he just tried harder. He braced himself for it, for the speech, for the lecture. But JD didn't start talking about personal responsibility. He didn't say anything about bad choices or effort or bootstraps. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out, not forcing it on Eddie, just letting it sit there between them. "This is someone who can help you," JD said simply. Eddie looked at the paper, but didn't take it right away. His fingers twitched at his sides. He had been handed things before, pamphlets for shelters that were already full, flyers for programs that had waiting lists a mile long, business cards from social workers who never answered their phones, empty promises wrapped in good intentions. He had no reason to believe this was any different. He let out a slow breath, eyeing JD carefully. "Yeah?" he muttered. "And what's the catch?" JD didn't flinch. "No catch," he said. "Just an opportunity." Eddie hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed down on him in a way he wasn't expecting. $1 was easy. It was simple. It didn't come with questions or expectations. This was something else entirely. And that scared him more than anything. Eddie stared at the folded paper in JD's hand, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. He wanted to believe it was real. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just another empty promise. But he had been here before. Handed numbers that led to dead-end voicemails, told to show up just to be turned away. It was always the same story. Good intentions didn't keep you warm at night. They didn't put food in your stomach. And they sure as hell didn't change the fact that at the end of the day, he'd still be out here, still asking for $1, still waiting for a break that never came. A small shift in the street around them made him realize they weren't alone anymore. People were slowing down, lingering nearby, pretending not to listen but making it obvious they were. A woman a few feet away clutched her grocery bag a little tighter, her gaze flickering between them before she looked away, pretending to be interested in something across the street. A teenager, hoodie pulled low, stood with his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, watching without watching. A man leaning against a lamppost had his phone out, the angle just a little too high to be anything other than recording. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. Someone scoffed, not loud, but enough for Eddie to hear. A guy in a baseball cap, arms crossed, shook his head. "Just give him the money, man," he muttered under his breath, but not low enough that it wasn't meant to be heard. Eddie clenched his jaw. He had been in this position before. People watching, waiting for him to react, waiting to see what kind of person he was. Was he the ungrateful homeless guy who refused help? The desperate one who grabbed at anything offered? Either way, there'd be an opinion. There always was. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look back at JD. "What if I show up and they got nothing for me?" His voice was quieter now, like he didn't really want to ask but had to. Like he needed to say it out loud before the hope settled in too deep. JD didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket again, but this time, instead of more paper, he pulled out a small black flip phone. Nothing fancy, just a basic burner phone, the kind you could pick up at any corner store. He held it out toward Eddie. "If they don't," JD said evenly, "call me." Eddie blinked. His eyes flickered from JD's face to the phone, then back again. He had expected a lot of things. A lecture, a pat on the shoulder, maybe even some well-meaning advice about staying strong. But not this. A few gasps rippled through the small crowd. Not loud, but noticeable. Someone shifted nearby, the rustle of a jacket cutting through the noise of the street. A woman let out a breath like she'd been holding it, shaking her head slightly. Another scoffed. Not everyone believed what they were seeing. A man in a flannel shirt, arms crossed over his chest, spoke up from near the curb. "This some kind of political stunt?" His voice was skeptical, sharp, the kind of tone that carried a challenge. "Cameras are out, people are watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless guy. What happens when they stop watching?" Eddie's fingers curled slightly at his sides. He knew that voice, that doubt. He had heard it in his own head 100 times before. He turned to JD, half expecting him to stumble, to backtrack, to say something polished and rehearsed. But JD didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the guy in the flannel. His eyes stayed on Eddie. "What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching." The words hung in the air, heavy and certain. Eddie let out a slow breath. He could feel the weight of the phone still sitting in JD's outstretched hand, waiting for him to take it. The crowd was watching, waiting to see what he'd do next. But for the first time in a long time, Eddie wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the phone, about the number in his other hand, about the chance in front of him, and whether he was ready to take it. Eddie stared at the phone in JD's hand, his fingers twitching at his sides. It was such a simple thing, just a cheap flip phone, nothing special, nothing fancy. But right now, it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He knew what this was. It wasn't just a handout. It wasn't just some easy fix that would let him scrape by another day. It was a challenge. A door cracked open, waiting for him to step through, and that scared the hell out of him. The air felt thick, the sounds of the city suddenly distant, like everything had narrowed down to this one moment. Eddie could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, waiting, judging. He had been here before, people watching, making up their minds about him before he even spoke. He knew the stories they told themselves, that he was lazy, that he didn't really want help, that guys like him never changed. A voice cut through the tension, sharp and dismissive. "He won't take it," a man muttered from somewhere behind the small gathering. Always an excuse. Eddie clenched his jaw. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. He already knew the type. Someone who thought they had him all figured out. Someone who thought they knew what kind of man he was just by looking at him. He'd heard it before, from strangers, from people he used to know, even from himself in his worst moments. JD didn't say anything. He just kept holding out the phone, steady, patient, no pressure, no lecture, just a choice. Eddie exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. His fingers twitched again, then curled into fists before relaxing. He didn't know if he believed in second chances. He didn't know if this would change anything. But he knew that if he walked away now, if he let this slip by like every other half-hearted promise he'd been given, then nothing would ever change. His fingers closed around the phone. He felt the smooth plastic in his palm, real and solid, something he could actually hold on to. He swallowed hard, shifting his weight as he rolled it between his hands, letting the reality of it sink in. "Guess I make a call," he muttered, almost to himself. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't some big declaration. But it was something, a first step, a moment of possibility. And sometimes, that was enough. JD didn't say anything else. He didn't push, didn't try to convince Eddie of anything. He just gave a small nod as if to say, "It's yours now. What you do with it is up to you." Then, without ceremony, he stepped back, slipping his hands into his pockets once again. No pressure, no theatrics, just an open door, waiting. The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy, until the crowd started to break apart. Some people lingered for a few seconds longer, watching Eddie like they were expecting something more, some final twist to the story. But when nothing happened, when JD didn't make a speech, when Eddie didn't drop the phone or throw it back, one by one, they drifted away. A woman murmured something to her friend before walking off. The teenager in the hoodie pulled out his own phone, shaking his head as he turned back toward the street. Even the man in the flannel, the one who had called it a stunt, scoffed under his breath before moving on. Not everyone was convinced. Some probably thought Eddie would end up right back where he started. Some might have believed JD was just another politician doing something for the cameras. And maybe, in another life, in another version of this story, they'd be right. But that wasn't what this was. There were no guarantees here, no promises of a perfect ending. Just a man standing on a cold sidewalk, gripping a cheap phone, trying to decide if he was ready to take the first step towards something different. Eddie glanced down at the phone in his hand, rolling it over between his fingers. It wasn't much, just a number, just a chance. But it was more than he'd had yesterday. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and turned, walking away. Not just another man blending into the city, but someone carrying something new, something that might lead somewhere else.
Because not every opportunity comes the way we expect. The hardest part isn't taking help, it's believing you deserve it. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to see you, to offer a door instead of just $1. If you've ever had a second chance, share your story. Someone might need to hear it today.